and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm Dale, and today I'm continuing on in my Shroud solo series. This will probably be the last one for the semester. I'll start doing them back up again once I finish the semester at the end of April, early May, around there. So this one we're going to continue on with our assessment of the ordinary naturalistic hypotheses of the Shroud. So that's basically theories that just posit a dead body or human body, and the laws of nature operating by themselves without any divine design or without any artistic human design or anything like that. So remember those categories: ordinary artistic mechanisms. We looked at some of those before. We're going to look at a couple more newer ones once we finish off the old ordinary naturalistic category. And then there's also the extraordinary theses. So those are the three main categories of type of mechanism to explain the Shroud of Turin's body and bloodstain images. We're looking at our next ordinary naturalistic mechanism. We just finished the Volkringer patterns in part 15, and we're going to be moving on in part 16 here to the next one. But just before we do that, in part 15, I did have some fans get in, and there was some confusion, so I have to apologize for not being clear about this. But for example, with some of the minimal relevant features in terms of Volkringer patterns, so for example, high resolution or the three-dimensionality of the Shroud's body images, I assigned questionable statuses. So maybe Volkringer patterns could account for the three-dimensional info on the Shroud or not. That's not exactly what I was trying to say there. So what I was trying to say is questionable in terms of the contradictory sources. It's questionable whether Volkringer patterns can produce 3D images of leaves pressed in books. There's a lot of controversy there. And in fact, if you're being not generous, if you're just being honest and real, the 3D images that you're seeing up on your YouTube screen there of the leaves or the plants, they're not true three-dimensional images like the Shroud of Turin. So it's technically, they should be failures on this front. But I was being extra generous to the Shroud skeptic in assigning a questionable status for the plants in the books. Regardless, even if you don't fail, they should be a fail, but even if you grant questionable status for those, when it comes to applying the Volkringer patterns to the Shroud of Turin, it's an utter failure. Absolute failure, very improbable, in fact, scientifically impossible for Volkringer patterns to explain the Shroud of Turin's body images because it utilizes direct contact and gas diffusion mechanisms. And as we saw in parts 13 and 14, there are scientific evidence and reasons for saying that actually it's very, very improbable, if not impossible, scientifically speaking, for direct contact and or gas diffusion mechanisms to reproduce the Shroud's true three-dimensional information or its high resolution. It's very problematic, whether it's a lighter than air gas or a heavier than air gas, in terms of the lactic acid being posited here in gas form for the Volkringer patterns method. So yeah, in real life, it's an utter failure. When I was saying that, in terms of the three-dimensionality, for example, it's questionable as to whether Volkringer patterns can explain them or not, I was specifically saying, well, there's that controversy with respect to whether plants or leaves pressed in a book give us three-dimensional images or not. And quite frankly, if you look at the pictures, the answer is probably not. I mean, these are not representative of the true topographical information representative of body to cloth distance as we see on the Shroud Man, where it's perfection. No, these 3D images of these leaves are horrible and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to clarify what I was saying there. So I hope that's clear now. Number one, it's questionable at best, being too generous to the skeptic as to whether the Volkringer patterns can create 3D or high-resolution images of leaves pressed in books or plants pressed in books. It's probably, if we're being realistic, it's probably a failure. They probably can't even do that. But it's an absolute failure, proven beyond all reasonable doubt, and proven definitely on a balance of probabilities when you apply Volkringer patterns as the mechanism for encoding the Shroud Man's images, where there's, obviously you're not pressing a body flat in a book or something like that, or with two stone slabs. No, there's gaps in the air. Gases are affected by the air. They diffuse in all directions. This impacts things like high resolution, makes it impossible for the high frequency, three-dimensional information to be encoded, as we see with the Shroud Man. At best, all you get is low frequency in certain ideal conditions, and that's sort of thing. So, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that for a fan. With that, I'll shut up. Let's get into our next ordinary naturalistic mechanism. Okay, so our next method under evaluation here is the ordinary naturalistic mechanism known as the singlet oxygen theory, otherwise sometimes known as the Russell effect hypothesis, or some proponents call it the semi-contact theory. So this is by proponents, people like Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight, a couple of Shroud skeptics there. But really the most famous of them is Dr. Allan Mills, the one who's actually a scientist, got his PhD there, doctorate. And this came in around about the mid-90s, around 1995. And this is when Dr. Allan Mills proposed his own theory for how the images on the Shroud might have come into existence. Now, it's important to note that, once again, this is a combination type hypothesis. So this mechanism involving semi-direct contact, just like we saw with the Volckinger patterns and the gas diffusion in our previous shows. It also uses gas diffusion, of course. It also uses, interestingly, Volckinger patterns. So that's what we looked at part 15 last time. So Volckinger patterns is part of the explanations of this Russell effect theory. And then there's this added photographic Russell effect that's also posited to be part of the explanation for the Shroud's body images. And I was joking around with a horrible joke last time that this Russell effect was named after David Russell, the famous heretic from the Proselytize or Apostatize podcast. No, I was just joking. He's my partner there of the Theo Geeks podcast, and he's a Christian apologist just like myself. And he's a friend of mine. So, yeah, that was just my attempt at humor. It's horrible, I understand. Great. So, okay, so what is this Russell effect then? What is it we're talking about? Basically, the Russell effect is an effect. It was named after W.J. Russell. He's the guy who first discovered that there was unwanted images on primitive photographic plates back in 1897. So this was before Secondo Pia in 1898 took the first photographs of the Shroud of Turin, and we discovered those photographic negatives. 1 year prior to that, this Russell character discovered the Russell effect on certain primitive photographic plates. And Mills proposes, okay, well, maybe in the case of the Shroud of Turin, certain oils and sweat secreted from a tortured man's skin, this acted in conjunction with the blood and bacteria present on such a person in order to release certain gases such as singlet oxygen and also hydrogen peroxide. And then these would combine to produce a known photographic effect known as the Russell effect through Volckinger patterns to create the Shroud's body images. So that's a little bit of a mouthful here. So you can see there's multiple mechanisms working together to combine to produce this photographic effect. And that's what the Shroud's body images are. So let's have Dr. Allan Mills explain it to you in his own words here, as the expert Shroud skeptic in this case. He says, quote unquote, "It has been shown that some species of bacteria can evolve traces of hydrogen peroxide, and when coupled with singlet oxygen molecules, can give rise to a Russell image. These species of catalase-deficient organisms include members of the normal skin biota. It is therefore suggested that the evolution of traces of hydrogen peroxide from enhanced numbers of bacteria flourishing on the skin and hair of the man in the Shroud initiated a latent image on the contact side of the linen cloth draped over the supine body. The quote-unquote yellowing reaction due to autocatalytic oxidation by atmospheric oxygen developed this latent image over a period measured in decades." So just like with the Volckinger patterns, it's oxidizing the linen to create the yellow color, and it takes time, decades, for this coloring to become visible to the naked eye. So that's what the theory is here, in a nutshell. So with that said, let's get straight into the assessment. And it's important to note, once again, we'll cover this when we get to MRF number 6, but once again, the blood stains aren't involved at all, except for having bacteria in it that produces the hydrogen peroxide needed to create the Russell effect for the body images. But how did the blood stains transfer to the cloth? He doesn't know, he doesn't say. The Russell effect cannot, scientifically impossible by definition for it to explain the blood stains. Well, how does it get there? It just asserts and assumes direct contact must have been the explanation for the blood stains. It was just transferred through direct contact. And as we saw in part 13, I know I have to keep saying this because somebody might not have seen my previous shows, that this might be the first Shroud show they're listening to, so I just want to mention it for their benefit. But we already saw that in part 13, direct contact is impossible, scientifically speaking, to explain all of the Shroud's blood stains and their various physical chemical features that we see on the Shroud. So direct contact can't explain it. This method doesn't even attempt to explain how the blood stains became encoded on the Shroud. Again, it's as an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis. It's probably just assuming, oh, well, they got there through direct contact. Nope, utter failure. So right away, this mechanism by way of assessment is a failure because it cannot explain the blood stains, naturalistically speaking. But let's put that on hold for now. Let's start into our assessment, starting with minimal relevant feature number 1, based on the photographic negativity or quasi-negativity of the body images and the high resolution and image diffuseness of those same body images. How does this method perform on that front? So believe it or not, this hypothesis or mechanism is quite horrible. It's one of the worst, just like the old ordinary artistic hypothesis that we studied in as the first ordinary artistic mechanism, the painting hypothesis by Dr. Walter McCrone. It doesn't pass the photographic negativity or the quasi-negativity images. So we have to assign this a questionable status even for this first feature, which basically all the other ordinary artistic and ordinary naturalistic hypotheses are able to adequately explain. The Russell effect, it kind of struggles here. In terms of Dr. Allan Mills, he claims, well, of course I can do it, not a problem. Claims are cheap from Shroud skeptics. Nonetheless, there is this claim. And obviously it employs similar things to what we've seen before, like the Volkringer method above, which they do produce photographic negative images. That's undeniable. However, there is controversy here. And allow me to, quote, not bring in a pro-Shroud expert like a Christian or a biased Christian or someone who wants to believe the Shroud's a miracle. Let me bring in the Shroud skeptic, Nicholas Allan. Remember him from... I don't remember which part it is, but when we studied our proto-photo ordinary artistic mechanisms, this guy's a hyper-skeptic. He's an atheist. He's the skeptic who thinks, oh, well, it was produced by some kind of photographic, medieval photo technique. And we evaluated his hypothesis and showed it's an utter failure. It doesn't explain the Shroud's images and their formation at all. But let's quote him. What does he say about the Russell effect? And he's written a paper entitled The Shroud of Turin and the Singlet Oxygen Fallacy. And basically, they dispute that the photographic negative image can be produced as a result of the actions of a species of reactive oxygen, specifically singlet oxygen, which is the Russell effect needs to get off the ground here. So the Shroud skeptics themselves are saying it can't do this. So I assigned it a questionable status in terms of the photographic negativity. Now there's an additional problem here because this hypothesis specifically postulates that the gas has to diffuse across more than 4 centimeters of empty space. And as we know, it's a minimal relevant feature. Nothing beyond... The only things that encoded on the Shroud in terms of body images are things that were 4 centimeters or closer to the cloth at the time of the encodation. Anything beyond that, 4.1 centimeters or more, did not encode, or 4.01, whatever thing, anything beyond 4 centimeters didn't become encoded on the shroud at all. But this method says it had to be encoded across 4 centimeters of empty space, which is scientifically impossible. That's not what we have with the shroud. And even if we did posit this temporarily, forget about the fact of the matter, the fact that the shroud, well, it's just a fact that the shroud's body images were not encoded beyond 4 centimeters. Even if they were, this method would still fail to account for the Shroud of Turin's images. It would just produce very blurry, distorted images. These gases should have dissipated long before reaching the cloth. And this would result in one solid coloring, or a silhouette type effect, lacking all of the various color densities and image intensities and stuff, color intensities. So that's related to our next feature, minimal relevant feature number 2. It wouldn't be highly resolved at all. It would just be this blurry, so it would fail the high resolution aspect. So this is very problematic. Now, in terms of the silhouette, Dr. Allan Mills, in terms of the high resolution, he's aware of this problem, and he actually addresses it. So this is what he says, quote unquote, "Well, if the reactive chemical is considered to rise vertically to produce good resolution," again, why would gases rise vertically? So he's admitting this minimal relevant feature number 4, the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. He knows that's a fact, and he's got to have that. He's trying to say, well, somehow it's vertical. Well, what would cause the gases to diffuse vertically, strictly vertically, to get those good high resolution images, as opposed to diffusing in all directions? Again, he doesn't say, he's just assuming somehow it happened. Okay, so going back to his quote, okay, if the reactive chemical is considered to rise vertically to produce good resolution, then it cannot at the same time diffuse laterally to result in dilution and a less intense area of image. Instead, it would surely produce a silhouette. For this reason, I proposed the short-lived radical singlet oxygen as the active species initiating the latent image on the linen thread. So he's trying to get out of this. Well, singlet oxygen is a very short-lived, radically short-lived molecule. So maybe it would be extinguished before this blurring effect would take place, and we wouldn't have this problem accounting for the high resolution. However, here's the problem. Allan Mills, the Shroud skeptic or proponent of this mechanism himself, admits in this same paper, quote unquote, both ammonia and singlet oxygen. So ammonia, remember that was with Paul Vignon's vapograph hypothesis that we studied in part 13. Part 14. Both ammonia and singlet oxygen hypotheses experience difficulty with the dorsal image, or the dorsal view, where the body was presumably in close contact with the cloth of the shroud. Why is there not a solid silhouette on the dorsal side of the image? So Allan Mills is admitting his theory should produce non-high resolution images at the very least. Even if we grant the Shroud skeptic everything he wants to hear, even he says, well, it would still fail on the dorsal image. Well, utter failure. The Shroud of Turin's dorsal images are highly resolved. They're not blurry blobs or silhouettes and stuff like that. Allan Mills himself raises this question and admits, look, I can't provide an answer to this question. Utter failure. Total failure. This mechanism, throw it in the garbage right here and now. The Shroud skeptic himself admits it doesn't work. Okay, so we kind of saw, because of this silhouette problem, this one solid coloring issue that would happen with this mechanism that posits more than 4 centimeters of gas diffusion or more, it would fail the body image uniformity. It wouldn't produce differing color densities or differing color intensities at all. We would just get this one solid silhouette. So yeah, this technique would inevitably produce a silhouette on the dorsal image at the minimum, and hence this method just can't account for the uniform maximum densities aspect of the shroud. The dorsal side image will always be darker, have a higher maximal density, color density or darkness than the frontal image. By definition, it can't have, but yet that's not what we see with the Shroud of Turin. It has uniform densities on both the frontal and dorsal images. There's also the issue, look, such a mechanism working uniformly on both skin and hair. So substance uniformity. This method posits a body, so there is two substances, hair and skin at the least. And the substance uniformity aspect, this seems problematic, but here's what Mills himself says about this. He says, quote unquote, "The good representation of hair on both frontal and dorsal views must not be ignored. Hair is dead. There are no dying epidermal cells to release singlet oxygen." Oh, well, if that key ingredient is not there, how did a Russell effect form to produce the hair images that we see on the Shroud of Turin? This mechanism wouldn't be able to do that. So how does Mills address this? So basically, Mills kind of mentions later on in his article that in the 1920s, it was discovered that there are many genera of bacteria that release hydrogen or hydrogen peroxide as they grow, and that the peroxide formation produced from such a source could potentially account for why the hair and the beard were also encoded on the shroud. So this is kind of an ad hoc or a questionable element. He's saying, well, maybe there was a different genre of bacteria on the hair, and this produced the needed the needed molecules to create this Russell effect in terms of the hair, and it was different from that which operated in terms of releasing singlet oxygen to encode the skin of the Shroud Man. I think that's questionable, and that's me being charitable. It's very ad hoc component there. Okay, what about the three-dimensional? Minimal relevant feature number 3, the three-dimensionality of the Shroud's body images. Absolute failure. Even worse. So number 1, it would suffer from all the gas diffusion in general mechanisms, and therefore wouldn't encode 3D information as we see with the Shroud. It would utterly fail on this front. But it's even worse than the other gas diffusion models in this regards, because remember, on the dorsal image, we would get that silhouette, that solid coloring. Well, what is it that creates the Shroud's three-dimensional body images? Well, it's the topographic information, the image densities or darknesses and lightnesses, right? The closer a body part is, like the tip of the nose to the Shroud, the darker it is, versus the further away a body part is, the lighter it is. So there's that body to cloth distance one-to-one correlation there. And that's what the VP8 image analyzer or technology in computers, that's how they extract the three-dimensional images of the Shroud. This just wouldn't do that. We would get this silhouette for the dorsal images. The backside images wouldn't be three-dimensional at all. Utter failure. It would just be totally devoid of all differing color densities altogether. So not only does this suffer from from the problems, the failures of the gas diffusion mechanism in general, but it's even worse than the failures of the gas theories in general. It's just a total failure here. No tridimensional data would be encoded for this image at all. Okay, what about minimal relevant feature number 4? So the continuous full-length body images encoded through vertically mapped vertically mapped wrapping distortions are found on the Shroud. Remember, look it up at your YouTube screen, so it's path P, the straight line rectilinear and or perhaps curvilinear path P encodation path. It's not path E, which is the path for gas emissions, or which we would expect. It's not through absorption by pressing the cloth down onto, if it's at the tip of his nose, pressing it onto his cheek so that it gets the sides of the nose and stuff like that. That's path A, I believe, on your YouTube screens there. So, it's an utter failure. And it's even worse than a lot of other methods, because Dr. Mills' hypothesis requires this Russell effect requires the use of convection currents in order to encode the body images. But as has been scientifically proven through experiments by Doctors Jackson, Jumper, and Erkeline, these credible STIRP scientists, they tested this method and found that the convection currents highly influenced gases and vapors and that sort of thing to diffuse out in all directions, not in straight rectilinear vertical lines or encodation paths. Impossible, scientifically impossible. So this consideration alone disproves and falsifies this mechanism and the viability of this Russell effect hypothesis. Now, to be fair to the Shroud skeptic, Dr. Mills is aware of this problem, and he tries to avoid the problem by saying, well, the image-forming molecules were released as a gas, not as a vapor. So according to him, that would allow the gas to diffuse in a straight vertical line direction for each and every part of the body. Once again, it doesn't matter whether it's a gas or vapor. Gases diffuse in all directions. This is just total, unless there's some external mechanism that he's not positing to guide the gas or something like that. But look, it's just, this method posits convection currents, and those would affect the gases too. It has not been scientifically demonstrated that a gas would behave any differently than a vapor in this regard. No, they behave the same. Whether a gas or a vapor, the fact is these things are, their diffusive spreading is adversely affected greatly by even the smallest of convection currents. If you posit convection currents, you're in for a world of hurt, and you're not going to get those straight line vertical encodation paths. I would say scientifically impossible. If not, it's proven beyond reasonable doubt that this hypothesis would fail 99.99%. Remember Ray Rogers in the gas diffusion mechanisms proper, part 14, where he posits a heavier than air gas, and he tries to eliminate the convection currents to prevent this problem, because he knows it's impossible. If there's even the smallest of convection currents, it's game over here. So that's why he works so hard and say, well, maybe the tomb was so cold there were simply no convection currents and the gases were just hovering above the body and stuff like that. So yeah, Allan Mills' attempt here is just an utter failure. Doesn't matter whether it's gas or a vapor, it fails to establish this. Also, there's another aspect here that we haven't mentioned. What about the no body side images, or the top of the Shroud man's head being encoded? Well, this is a problem for this theory in the same way it was problematic for Volckranger patterns. So when we assess that in part 15, the exact same problems that apply here from gas diffusion and Volckranger patterns. No, we wouldn't get this feature where it's precisely the frontal and dorsal images and no body side images at all. Not even part of a body side image was encoded at all. So that wouldn't happen on this theory. That's an utter failure on this aspect as well. Minimal relevant feature number 5, body image superficiality on those 3 levels, the fabric, thread, and on the fiber. It's only on the primary cell wall, only the top 2 to 3 fibrils of each thread on the thread level superficially are colored. And then finally, fabric, it doesn't show up on the reverse side of the cloth. There would be an utter failure on this front. If it's a lighter than air vapor or gas, then obviously it would penetrate through the cloth and the coloring would take place beyond the superficial level, especially if these gas are going beyond 4 centimeters in some points without dissipating, according to the theory itself. Again, that wouldn't happen, but giving it the benefit of the doubt, it would be impossible for these images to be superficial. Now, in my written work, I just put not applicable here. I didn't give an analysis on the body image superficiality, non-cementation or capillary flow, and non-saturation for this mechanism, just because none of my scholarly sources addressed it. And I prefer to rely on actual scientists or actual experts when I'm making my point. So I'm just speaking off the cuff here on my point. Looking at what we learned about in the gas diffusion mechanisms with the vapograph hypothesis, and then the heavier than air gas of the Maillard reaction from Ray Rogers in part 14 of our Shroud solo series, we can pick up certain things. This is again employing gas diffusion, and if it's lighter than air, it's not going to be superficial. If they're heavier than air, he's wanting to say that they're heavier. That's how he's combating these convection currents thing, or trying to. Well, then you're going to have issues with non-saturation. Image is going to be saturated, especially in the areas of the bodily orifices covered in sweat and bacteria and all. Since this method doesn't posit that the body was removed from the shroud, it would be even worse on this front in terms of image saturation. It's an utter failure on minimal relevant feature number 5. Again, in my official work, my writing, and on my Excel file on my blog site there, I just put it as 3 purple not applicables because I don't have any Shroud scholars backing me up that specifically address the body image superficiality issue or the aspects of minimal relevant feature number 5 here. But I mean, it's an obvious inference. We can tell based on what we learned in previous episodes, we can apply it ourselves to this mechanism. We learned that it would be a failure if the Russell effect would not explain minimal relevant features number 5 in terms of superficiality or body image saturation, non-saturation. Okay, what about minimal relevant feature number 6? So this is about the condition of the Shroud Man, those anatomical accuracies, the blood stains that we talked about in the beginning, and there's no decomposition or putrefaction liquids in sufficient quantity found on the Shroud of Turin. So in terms of anatomical accuracies, just as we've done with all the direct contact and gas diffusion type mechanisms so far, we just granted it a green check mark for the sake of argument. However, because in this case with the Russell effect, because we found that the dorsal image would just be a solid silhouette, well, this means that it's impossible to account for all of the anatomical accuracies found on the dorsal side of the Shroud's images. There wouldn't be any discernible differences in intensity or density and that sort of thing that would correlate to the anatomical features that we see on the Shroud. His wounds, their swelling, and none of that would be visible on the dorsal side at all. So utter failure in terms of anatomical accuracies. We also said that the Russell effect or singlet oxygen hypothesis here uses direct contact. It can't explain the blood stains. In terms of no decomposition liquids, we can give it a green check mark. If we change it or adapt it to be like Ray Rogers, the body was somehow removed prior to decomposition, within 3 days before the decomposition liquids would have started accumulating on the Shroud. Just the failure on the anatomical accuracies for the dorsal image here. Okay, how does the Russell effect do on minimal relevant feature number 7, our final one? This is the additional features category. Well, in this front, there's 2 features that apply to this theory, just like we saw with the Volckinger patterns in part 15. So the first is additional feature number 3, related to the color. The Shroud's body images are yellow to light brown colored fibers, presumably of degraded or oxidized cellulose, as this hypothesis allows. Now, this mechanism entails the use of Volckinger patterns as part of the explanation. And as we saw in part 15, when we studied Volckinger patterns proper, there's controversy here. They produce brown images. All the known experimental data, empirical data to date, shows that they're brown in color. That's not the same color as the Shroud of Turin. So that's an utter failure. They produce this sepia brown images, and that doesn't match the Shroud's straw yellow color, even after long periods of time. Even after decades or centuries, it maintains this dark brown color or sepia brown coloring in terms of Volckinger patterns. So this is an utter failure. Being generous, again, I assigned this a questionable status when I looked at the Volckinger patterns in general, the Volckinger pattern method in part 15 proper. That was me being overly generous, because there's this controversy in the Shroud. Skeptics claim to provide quantitative data from spectral instruments showing, well, actually the colors are identical or near identical. I assigned a questionable status for that. So likewise, here, I'm going to assign a questionable status in terms of the body image color, reproducing that. Okay, finally, additional feature number 6. There's no spices, oils, or any other biochemical or organic substances or, bacteria or whatever associated with the human body in life or death, as this theory definitely has to say. So utter failure, right? There's no traces of bacteria or singlet oxygen molecules on the Shroud today. So in order to account for this, one has to engage in that highly ad hoc speculation. Well, all these molecules somehow oxidized entirely over the centuries, over time. Highly ad hoc, and therefore, just to be consistent, I assigned that questionable in Volckinger patterns and in gas diffusion. So let's give the Shroud skeptic a questionable status here. Okay, great. So that's it in terms of our assessment of the 7 minimal relevant features and all their aspects, and how this Russell effect mechanism did on that front. Let's get into our cumulative case considerations and conclusions in terms of how we think this theory operates as a good explanation in reference to the best explanation inference criteria. Okay, so In terms of the best explanation inference criteria, the first one is plausibility. Is this hypothesis, the singlet oxygen, i.e., Russell effect hypothesis, a plausible mechanism for explaining the Shroud's images? Well, no, it's an utter failure. First of all, on a practical level, there's been ample opportunity, just as with other gas diffusion, direct contact, or Volcranger pattern methods. They've all failed, both in the lab in terms of artificial tests, in the field and lab experiments, and naturally, there's no Shroud images are totally unique in human history. And it's important with the artificial tests. This includes the tests conducted by Dr. Allan Mills himself, the proponent of this Russell effect method. All of his attempts have failed to produce the desired results. Though it is important to note with this that Dr. Mills would actually deny that there's been a sufficient opportunity to artificially test his hypothesis, and that's due to the fact that there's been a discontinuation of suitable Kodak film that he's able to use to test his hypothesis. So that's his response there. Nonetheless, I think it's pretty implausible given we've had lots of people buried in shrouds and we've had experiments with sweaty bodies and gas diffusion, gas in this way or whatever. So, and still no body image is produced. So it's a failure here. Additionally, there is a theoretical implausibility here, right? So singlet oxygen molecules, which are hypothesized here to make the Russell effect, released as even as a pure gas. So that's a single state molecule as opposed to a vapor, which has two phases, both gas and liquid states, kind of as a mixture or a combination there. Positing that even a gas could diffuse in a strictly vertical direction, absolute nonsense. Everything we know, all the science tells us that gases diffuse randomly in all directions, just as vapors do. So this is highly implausible postulation unless you go beyond this mechanism and posit some kind of external mechanism that would guide the gas or something. But that's not a part of this mechanism, right? So such as the electrostatic mechanisms, they could do it or something like that. But on this front, without that, just saying that gases could flow vertically, that's very implausible. The theory also fails to have explanatory scope because it fails to account for the bloodstains, for example. It has to rely on direct contact and assuming that direct contact would work. Or the proponents themselves. Dr. Allan Mills admits that it's not a suitable mechanism to encode the dorsal image, for example. It just utterly fails to encode a dorsal image, as we see with the Shroud of Turin. Explanatory power. Obviously, it utterly fails explanatory power. As we saw in our assessment, it fails or is very improbable to account for, or even impossible to account for several of our minimal relevant features like three-dimensional data, vertically mapped wrapping distortions, no body sides, the high resolution images. There's also a lot of ambiguity in terms of whether it can produce photographic negative images. It also suffers in areas with body image uniformity, in terms of the density of color. Utter failure. It's just, it fails all three: explanatory power, explanatory scope, and the plausibility criterion. Okay, what about finally the less ad hoc criterion? Well, this hypothesis employs many not evidenced assumptions as I mentioned. For example, all of the chemicals or singlet oxygen molecules happen to oxidize completely and therefore weren't detectable by the STIRP scientific instruments in 1978. It also assumes that the linen cloth would behave in the same way that a highly sensitive photographic plate would. Remember, this Russell effect is based upon a discovery in 1897 about an effect on old photographic plates. So this theory kind of assumes that, well, the linen cloth would behave in the same way that a highly sensitive photographic plate would. Are you kidding me? Very improbable, I should say. This isn't just an ad hoc, a non-evidenced assumption. It's also based on our background knowledge. It's implausible, improbable. So this failed to treat a linen cloth in this scenario and think it would be anywhere comparable to a photographic plate in 1897, where this Russell effect would be observed and that sort of thing. And thereby Russell effects could also be translated to a linen cloth burying the Shroud Man. That's very, very implausible on a theoretical level. We saw some of the problems when you evaluated Nicholas Allan and the proto-photo hypotheses where they tried to treat the linen cloth. They had to come up with ridiculous notions to try and get that cloth sensitive enough to light where it would transmit and create images and that photographic images and stuff. And you're telling me even without that special treatment here, and this hypothesis doesn't posit any of that kind of special treatment of the linen cloth at all. So it's extremely implausible, scientifically impossible, I would say. It utterly fails, 0% on the plausibility criterion, let alone the fact that it's also failing this less ad hoc criterion by making this ad hoc assumption that linen cloths would be in any way analogous to a photographic plate in 1897 whereby the Russell effects took form. 2, that the singlet oxygen molecule could be released as a gas as opposed to a vapor, and that this gas would then diffuse in a strict vertical 180 degree direction from all points of the body equally. And this, despite all of our scientific knowledge saying that's complete bunk and rubbish, no, they diffuse in all directions. In the same way a vapor would. Doesn't matter. Vapors are just two phases. It's gas and liquid kind of mixture, whereas gas is just pure gas. Finally, 3, we also have the fact that the gas would not, they have to assume that the gas would not dissipate before reaching the cloth at a distance of more than 4 centimeters above the underlying body, and therefore avoid resulting in a blurry image. Yeah, right. Especially if it's beyond the distance of 4 centimeters, we're going to get a blurry image. That's what all the scientific proof, multiple dozens of experiments prove this is what we'll get every time. It's a law of nature. But yet this theory is assuming that somehow gases traveled only in vertical lines more than 4 centimeters and did not result in a blurry image. Get out of here. Come on, skeptics. Come on. Last point before we finish up here. Look, this method or mechanism employs at least 4 different types of mechanisms. Direct contact or semi-direct contact, gas diffusion, proper Volcranger patterns, and the Russell effect all working in conjunction with each other in perfect synchronicity so as to form the Shroud's body images. This is by far the simplest this is far from the simplest explanation. And Occam's razor would say we should rule it out. This is very ad hoc. Perhaps some of the non-evidenced assumptions we've mentioned here, maybe on their own, we could say, well, maybe, or something like that. But taken all together, it stretches the limits of credulity. It makes it impossible to believe and makes the mechanism an improbable explanation for the Shroud's body images. Yeah, I'll just end with this taken together, a quote here talking about the ludicrous nature of this kind of ad hoc assumptions that are employed for this theory to work. Quote unquote, gases, molecules, linen cloth, and the underlying body all, quote unquote, conspired to naturally work together to produce these unprecedented effects. This is the largest assumption of all. So that's from our good friend Mark Antonacci, the pro-Shroud expert and Christian there. I agree fully with him. The failure on the less ad hoc criterion and its complexity here and sheer quantity of non-evidenced assumptions makes this theory very improbable, especially when we have other ones that are similar to it that don't need to be as ad hoc as this one. So utter failure on this front. That's it in terms of this theory. I had a note about the criterion of illumination. This is something I haven't been looking at, but it is a 5th criterion I do address in my written work. I say that it's neutral and or at best passes. It would be the same with the Volcranger methods. But for example, it says, why isn't the Shroud of Turin mentioned in the Gospels? Well, just like pro-Shroud experts like Mark Antonacci or people who posit ultraviolet radiation, this image mechanism takes time for the images to develop and become visible to the naked eye, so that could provide some illumination as to why there isn't explicit mention of the Shroud of Turin in the Gospels or in the New Testament literature. And again, that's assuming that it's not there. Some people have argued Galatians chapter 3 talks about the Shroud specifically, verse 1 there. But again, even if assuming that the Bible doesn't mention it, certainly the Gospels don't talk about images on the Shroud itself. That much is for sure.
Well, why is that? Well, if this mechanism was true, that would provide some measure of illumination because it took time for the images to develop. So I gave it a passing grade on the illumination criterion, which is just a bonus. But again, it doesn't speak in favor of it because the supernatural mechanisms of radiation also posit it taking time for the images to show up, to become visible to the naked eye. So there's no reason to privilege this over any other mechanism. But I just wanted to mention that criterion of illumination that I've been excluding from my Shroud solo series, but it is in my written work as a bonus criterion only. And there was that consideration here that I wanted to bring up. So yeah, that's it. Awesome. So next time we will finish off. This will probably be after April, sometime in May, once my semester is done. And we'll pick up and refute another ordinary naturalistic hypothesis. This one is different, though. It's by Dr. Leoncio Garza Valdez in the 90s, 1993 to 1998, in and around there. And Garza Valdez basically came up with what he called the quote-unquote bacterial or fungal hypothesis as an ordinary naturalistic mechanism for the Shroud of Turin. So the Shroud's body images are caused by bacteria and fungus, fungi of some sort. Let's see how this does. Hint, not well. But we'll get into that next time. All right. Next, look out next time. This Saturday, I will post up a show. I've decided what I'm going to post. It's the Skeptics and Seekers show. The last show I was a guest on, involved in with the topic of morality. And it also has my good friend and brother in Christ, Marvin Wallace, was on there. He was in the first part. I think Randall Rouser was also in it for a little bit to discuss a new book or something. We're going to be discussing biblical morality and finishing up their morality roundtable with a bunch of skeptics from SNS and myself and Marvin Wallace and Randall Rouser. So I'll post that part 1 of that this Saturday. So and then April 22nd is the Shroud Wars debates with Giulio Fonte, Bob Seifgard, and Bob Rucker, round 1. So look forward to that. All right. Have a great week. Bye-bye.